Good evening, welcome, and welcome to this first seminar in the series on levelling up, regional disparities, inequality, and social inclusion. My name's Colin Mayer. I'm a professor here in Oxford at the Saïd Business School, and also now a professor at the Blavatnik School of Government. It's my very great pleasure to introduce you to this series. The subject of levelling up is one that is of great concern around the world. We talk a lot about inequalities within nations in terms of disparities in income and wealth between rich and poor nations, developed and the developing world, in terms of the extent to which issues such as gender, age, education, ethnic background influences one's earnings and wealth accumulation. But we hear very much less about the relevance of place and the significance of the disparities that arise within countries because of location. We hear about differences between north and south of Italy, between east and west of Germany, between Slovenia and Switzerland, between the Midwest and the coasts of America and many other parts around the world. But it's also the case that it's not often recognized that this country, the UK, has some of the worst regional disparities of any developed country in the world, at least according to some measures. And that's given rise to a real emphasis in policy on ways of addressing that issue. And since the 1960s, the notion of regional economic policy has been emphasized repeatedly in terms of ways of redistribution between different parts of the country, in terms of incentives, investment incentives, employment incentives, tax and subsidies. But nothing has really made a significant difference. Indeed, on many criteria, the problem has got worse. Got worse in this country, arguably worse in many other countries, including in the United States. So what is needed is a rather more imaginative approach to how one should be addressing this issue. And what we're going to be exploring over the course of the seminars that we're going to be having over the next few weeks is what are the real underlying problems that are giving rise to this issue? What are the real causes? What are the potential approaches for dealing with this? And in particular, what are the ways in which one can really effectively bring about change? And we're going to look at this in terms of the role of the public policy, the private sector, education, social policy. And we're going to be hearing from people from academia, leaders of business, policy making, government, local government, etc. And this evening we begin with business. And we're very fortunate in having with us Laxman here this evening, who is currently the CEO of Reckitt, which was formerly known as Reckitt Kaiser. And before that, to those of you who are old enough in Britain to remember the company as Reckitt Coleman, with its famous Coleman mustard. And before that, he was Chief Commercial Officer at PepsiCo. And before that, he was Director of the Delhi office of McKinsey. He's had a a very varied career, including being part of the Prime Minister's and the Chancellor's Build Back Better Council. And indeed, he very kindly gave up a meeting of that council to be here with us this afternoon. So we should all feel extremely honored that we've got you with us this afternoon. So thank you very much indeed. And what I'd like to do, Laxman, is to start by just exploring with you your career development and the way in which your career has influenced your thinking and your interest in the topic that we're talking about today.
Well, first of all, Professor Mayer, it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me. As I walked into this building, I saw the big plaque in Sanskrit. And in some ways, it felt a bit like I was coming home. I realized this building, which I did not know, was a building that had been set up to train Indian administrators in the late 1800s. And I see some of the architecture, which looked particularly Indian as well. So it's an honor to be here and to be in this building. I am originally from India. I'm an American now by nationality, but I grew up in a place called Pune, which in a lot of ways has the touch of, in parts of Pune, of the Tatars, a big family house in India. I've traveled in various parts of India, and you could see how business had an impact on the place. I traveled to Jamshedpur in 2010 to give a speech there, which was actually the Jay and Tata speech at what's known as XLRI, which is an institute in Jamshedpur. And in a lot of ways, as I walked around, I saw how in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Tatars had actually created a city for where they put a steel plant and essentially built a whole community around it. And again, you saw the impact of place and business and the role that it had there. Over the course of my life, I've lived in various places in the world. My family complains that this is, I think, our 20th home in about 28 years of marriage. So we've moved around a lot. But over the course of this time, I've had the fortune of living in Philadelphia, living in Cleveland, and Pittsburgh. You see really the role of the medical systems and the universities locally, making Cleveland a great place for health tech today, and Pittsburgh, with Carnegie Mellon University of Pittsburgh, essentially becoming a great center for robotics and machine learning. I spent 7 years in Palo Alto, California, so not far from Stanford, where you saw the hand of Stanford, the venture capital community, the old Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, and the others, essentially creating Silicon Valley. I've lived in Japan, and you see Tokyo and Yokohama, and once again, you see the collision of business, the sort of directed policymaking that Japan was so famous for, in effect, developed the Tokyo-Yokohama system. And I've lived in India as well as part of my work in Delhi, as you pointed out, where again, what you see is urban planning becomes such a very big deal. So my career in a lot of ways has brought me right front and center into various parts of the world, developed and developing, but really the role of place as well, which is so important. I sit on the board of Brookings, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., and we run what's called the Metro Studies program there. And again, what we see there is leadership being exhibited in cities in order to really drive development. So all of that put together hopefully gives me a bit of a basis to come to a university as fine as this and to a center as fine as this to hopefully provide you with some perspectives.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about the company that you're now leading, Reckitt, and the nature of the company and what its history is and how it relates to this issue.
Sure. I went to Hull shortly after becoming CEO. And one of the things I did was I actually met the family, Reckitt, the descendants of the family. And what is interesting about the company is if you go back, 200 plus years, the family Reckitt, entrepreneurs in starch. And then they added a variety of other businesses to it. You mentioned the food business, which was sold some time ago. But also what happened as things went on is they were entrepreneurs and they were based in Hull. And in 1931, one of their people created the brand Dettol. I'm glad to see, by the way, there's a bottle of Dettol right there. I can see that, and I'm so glad it's there. And I know that it's, I saw that in the library too, so I know that the surfaces are hopefully very clean as a consequence of that. But in 1931, Dettol was developed largely to address the issue of maternal sepsis. You come into World War II, and in 1939, as you know, the Battle of Britain began. When the planes were flying over London dropping bombs, these planes didn't want to leave and go back with payload. So they actually went north and they turned at Hull. And while they were turning in Hull, they knew the shipyards were there. They unloaded the bombs that were and flew to Germany. One of the factories they targeted was the Dettol factory, because obviously it's quite important in the war in order to help soldiers recover from all the injuries they had. We had to dismantle the factory. We have books on this, by the way. The factory was dismantled and taken to a secret place somewhere in the center of the country in order to continue to provide supply. In 1870, a scientist in Germany created Lysol. And it was created as an antidote to what was going on at that time, which was the cholera epidemic. Now, it so happens that the two companies came together. Lysol is a brand that, of course, is quite central to us, particularly in the US. It's a much, much bigger brand in the US than it is in Germany. So you can see that we now have all these brands in the disinfectant space. Over time, we bought a bunch of businesses that are health-oriented. Brands like Nurofen and Durex, and those are the brands that have all come together, and BioFreeze recently. But we have a business in health and hygiene and nutrition. And this company had to basically, along with our team, figure out why we existed as a company. The word purpose is used quite often, but really, this was for us an existential question. Why did we exist? And I remember in September of 2019, none of the stuff that you're going through right now, and the reason many of you are wearing masks, really was something we knew. But we looked at the maps in the R&D center that we have, Research and Development Center in Montville, New Jersey, and there you see, we have bugs of the world, and where are all the bugs, and how is this thing evolving? And you realize one of your questions downstairs is, how do you essentially prevent communicable disease around the world? These bugs are getting bigger. With climate change, they're living longer, they're biting more. And so we realized in the October-November timeframe of that year that we existed to protect, heal, and nurture in the relentless pursuit of a cleaner and healthier world. That was why we existed. Now, this was September and October. We had no idea. And in January, we went to the board and told them this is why we existed. This is our strategy. It's January 15th. And January 16th or 17th, we got a call from Wuhan, China, where the world's largest Dettol factory is about 150 or so kilometers from the epicenter of the coronavirus. And we've been asked to keep the factory open, which we did. And of course, you see things comes full circle. And the reason why we existed really has found great relevance to some of the challenges we've had over the last 2 years. Going back to the city of Hull, one of the things you see there is over the course of 200 years, our people have been deeply engaged in Hull. You will see many roads. We used to have, obviously, a place where people lived, a bit like what you talked about, Oxford North. We had our own sort of area where the workers lived, township, in effect. Some of the factory managers gave back to the city. So you walk around there, you'll see buildings or roads that have essentially been contributed to by people in the company. And what made me particularly, I would say, inspired was we still continue to do that. The Reckitt Foundation is a shareholder in this company, and dividends matter to the foundation, and they told me that. And all the dividends that we give our shareholders. The Reckitt Foundation, whatever dividends they get, they give it out into the community. And so do we. We match too, and we're obviously very engaged. So this is a company that exists to protect, heal, and nurture. It takes great brands, particularly British brands, but also more broadly global brands, takes them around the world. When I grew up in India, and at the age of 6, I lost my brother who was 8, but when he fell ill, my mother would wash the house with Dettol. Our clothes would be washed with Dettol. And Dettol reached the Commonwealth in some ship that left Hull. And I saw the impact of it. So as a company, Hull is very important to us. And we as a company had gotten away from those roots. And I think great companies have wings and they have roots. It's very important for both to be there. And our roots are in Hull, and we essentially adopted it. And the work we're doing in Hull, in effect, is really around how we ensure Hull is brought to today's world. Britain will not be net zero unless the Humberside is net zero. And we've, over the last 12 to 18 months, really focused on how we essentially corral every resource we can, including the Prime Minister's Council, the CBI, and others, in order to direct the notion of place and how Hull and the Humberside can be brought into the century.
Well, I'd like to explore that a little bit further, but just before I go on, let me say we're going to be talking this way for half an hour or so, and then we're going to throw it open to questions from you. So please do think about the questions that you'd like to pose to us. And those of you online, and I should welcome all of you online as well, please do take the opportunity of raising questions through the Q&A on the Zoom facility. And when you do so, they will be signaled and someone will ask the question on your behalf. So those of you online should feel as much a part of this conversation that we'll go on having as everyone else here in the room. So let's just explore a bit further. What does that mean for Reckitt to give back to Hull and to help develop Hull? What do you see as your objective there?
Well, to put it in a perspective that I think all of us really understand, it is a place where we employ several thousand people. We have a factory there. We have a largest R&D center there. We're obviously doing cutting-edge research in the place. So there's a sort of a parochial view which says it matters to our people. We're bringing global talent into Hull. We want it to be attractive for them to come into it. What we also realize is that we can't do this alone. We're going to have to find a whole range of partners in order to ensure we have an adequate supply of skilled people who come into the system, that we attract entrepreneurs and company owners whose suppliers work with us in the area, that we get a great resource and a resource that we can work with closely. That we work with the university to get highly skilled master's candidates coming in. And so place matters to us. We can move people there, but we can move there if it's a great place to live. Now, I know Philip Larkin's poetry is fairly depressing at some points in time, but the reality is that that's not just the place. I mean, it's a place we hope will be much more attractive to great people. And I'm going to ensure that it happens. Otherwise, we will have a challenge over time in terms of driving innovation, particularly since we depend on Hull so much.
So how's that going to happen? It sounds like a big coordination exercise. You can't take the lead on your own. Should you do it with other large companies in and around Hull? Should it be the local government, the regional authority? Who should be taking the lead in this?
We simply cannot do it alone. And in fact, what we have done is we have a coalition now of 30 companies. The thing is that we're going through a major industrial revolution. I mean, Glasgow last week, COP and others, the center of the industrial revolution, of course, it started right there, you might argue, with the steam engine and what was done there. Well, we're seeing a major change, a major shift in terms of, particularly with the green, emphasis, what's happening with renewable power, what's happening with the creation of these large gigafactories, particularly given some of the EU rules around, origin and all of it. And so there is actually a dislocation going on just in the nature of industry. And Hull is very well placed. One of the things I said to the Prime Minister was, if we're going to be the Saudi Arabia of wind, Hull has to be the Jeddah And if Hull is going to be the Jeddah, then what are we going to do to make Hull a really productive Jeddah? Now, you've clearly got the major wind factory there. You've got offshore wind capable there. You've got companies that are essentially investing in order to serve that area. And it creates 25% of the emissions of the UK today, which we have to solve. Now, that can't happen unless we say, how are we going to retool, reskill, and frankly, rebuild Hull? But it's not just Hull, it's the Humberside overall.
Right.
Which then gets into all the bottlenecks you have. First one, of course, is local governance, where what we've done is with the marketing authority and as well as with the authority that brings together various governments, local governments, beyond political sort of affiliations, in order to come together to create a platform that actually is engaged in this program. We need to get together with, because part of what they do is they've got to worry about transportation and how do we ensure that transportation becomes green all the time, the kind of investments you make. How do we ensure that the buildings and the houses get the right level of regulatory oversight, but also the investment in order to make them green? I mean, only 1 out of 28 homes in the UK is today fit for purpose from the standpoint of the green regulations. And that's sort of the city and how they're working to make that happen. Then you've got the University of Hull has obviously got an extension program. We work with them closely. But you cannot level up a place unless the university that's linked to that also levels up. So you've got the Chancellor, the Baroness Bodmsley, and the entire team that are engaged on how is it the University of Hull can level up. Education is a challenge there. Some of the schools have in some ways fallen behind. And so the government needs to come in and actually help on schools. We can't do just that. But we can on skills, because skills is a very big deal. So we've created a model along with a bunch of others in the area, a terrific UTC, the Ron Deering UTC, which is a skills development, vocational skills center in Hull. One of our folks sits on the board, as do leaders from other companies. Having visited it, I was amazed by it. I was amazed by the quality of the kids, the kind of questions they ask. And frankly, we have apprenticeship programs where we take some of them to come in, both for projects, but also for work. And then they graduate and they come into our company. And given the fact that it's a bit more like the German system, I guess, where theoretically after several years, they could find a way to flip into formal education and get a degree and all of that and move on. And we've got to find ways to encourage that. And clearly the system does it. But the nature of the curiosity, the questioning of the kids was quite amazing. So you've got the skills coming in and the partnership with us to build skills for people. Then the linkage into the community, which gets into entrepreneurship. And how do we ensure we potentially even create space in our R&D center, bring people in, collaborate on ideas and, try and do that, like I know some of the other companies are doing as well. So to me, this is, as you can tell, it's a fairly comprehensive effort. It isn't just about us. And, we're only one of 30. You've got the biggest employer in wind, putting a big factory there. You've got the port, and the port's going through its own change. So we have to find a way to ensure that it's really the entire place that levels up. Otherwise, the statistics are, as you rightfully said at the outset, they are concerning.
Right.
I mean, as countries have grown, countries that have cities or places that in some ways have benefited from technology and technological innovation. If I might say, Oxford and Cambridge's Golden Triangle clearly being a great example of that. They've had disproportional growth compared to some of the other places. They clearly have fallen behind. And if I go back to this Brookings work that I mentioned earlier to you, they looked at 100 cities in the US. And in the US, what you found is that of the 100, 63 of the 100 metro centers, in effect, grew GDP overall. So it's about 2/3, let's say. Only 1/3 of them grew GDP overall, but also grew productivity, which essentially shows you the mix of work that they have. So only 1/3 of them have grown productivity. But interestingly enough, only 10% of them not only grew GDP, grew productivity, but also grew inclusively. And so you essentially have this thing falling behind being such a big deal even in those places. And you see that in the political systems of the political processes that, have basically played themselves out in various parts of the world, the US and the UK clearly being part of it. But if only 10% of them are, fully inclusive, well, we didn't even add the green lens to it because this was research done in 2017. What you realize is this is actually quite complicated. It cannot be done simply. So we need to find a way for various bodies to come together to make that happen. And what is curious about this is the places that have grown inclusively did not just grow high skills work, the technology, the digital, and all of that. They also grew, I'm going to call it relatively low skills work. So it's not just the residential and sort of the hospitality and hoteling and all that, but also manufacturing jobs. Mm-hmm. So you've got to essentially do both, otherwise you won't have inclusivity. It's going to be the story of Silicon Valley, San Francisco, San Jose, Seattle, where they've grown enormously well, but it's localized in extremely high skilled jobs. And the rest of them have all kinds of urban problems with regard to the cost of homes, the drive from Stockton to San Francisco to come to work if you're working in more of the menial services or in the more sort of basic skill services. And so people really go through real challenges in order to deal with what's happening in some of these places. We've got to make it much more equal. So just back to all of that suggests you've got to have a plan and you've got to find a way to grow companies like us, but also find ways to grow some of the more high skill technology jobs that do exist. And then you've got to do it in a way that's comprehensive, otherwise you leave people behind, even in places that are left behind.
Now, first of all, does Hull have a plan of that sort? Is there an agreement around what that scenario should look like? And secondly, this point about inclusion is, I think, critically important. And can business do that, or does it need a lot of government subsidies and support to achieve it?
So first of all, Hull is building the plan. I think that's the fair way to characterize it. And I think part of what we're trying to do is draw attention to the Humber side so we can, in effect, corral government help, CBI help. Ernst & Young has partnered with us in order to help us build this plan, the University of Hull and others, because we're trying to draw attention and also draw attention from London because great policies, but we need to find a way to land in place. And I think this government has been incredibly supportive of all the work that we've been trying to do. So that's part of it is there. And clearly in the early part of next year, hopefully the Chancellor will announce the clusters. CBI will also do their own announcement of clusters. And Hull will hopefully be one of them. And with that will come additional resourcing and help in order to make that happen. We are going to need government help. Schooling is an area, obviously, you're going to need public sector help, public help. If I look at skill building and capacity building, particularly on the leadership side of the public sector, that's a government sort of, obviously is an area you're particularly extremely well versed in. But we've also got to find ways in the private sector to lean in and build the capability of our people in order to make that happen. So I think to me, what we are in right now is a recognition of the importance of place. We've aligned multiple stakeholders. We're waiting for a few announcements. But I'll tell you one thing, the local people in Hull are absolutely ready to go. Because we know how important it is for the UK.
So business is ready to go as well? Are there a number of large businesses that are eager to get in?
Every one of the large businesses in Hull are in the 30, and they're leaning in. I mean, nowhere do you go and ask a question and they say, no, this isn't for us, or we're not part of the solution. I think you see businesses are leading quite enormously into this because they recognize the value of it.
What about small businesses, starting businesses, and entrepreneurship? Isn't that key to making this work?
It is. Now, that's part of how you encourage them. That includes both, financing. I think we've had conversations before about how do we attract venture capital of various sorts into the area. When you go back to J.D. Vance and you look at the Midwest of the US, one of the things he did was he, of course, left Silicon Valley and went to Cincinnati or to Columbus in order to create his center. If you look at the experience in the US, you look at Cleveland tomorrow, the work going on in Columbus or the Ohio area, or frankly what's happening in Pittsburgh with both philanthropic money, but also the ability to recognize entrepreneurship at Carnegie Mellon and at the University of Pittsburgh. I think there's a real role to play for entrepreneurship, but also the encouragement of entrepreneurs. I mean, the Silicon Valley story is really that. I mean, obviously, Stanford spawning entrepreneurs, the venture capital community moving there, big, large companies created, wealth generated, those people then going into second and third generation creation of entrepreneurs. And it's a very sort of positive spiral of activity. And we need to somehow, in our own way, recreate that in various other places. And so entrepreneurship is very important. And I think our people on the ground are very open and very already participating in mentoring some of these small businesses. But it's not yet at the scale that you say has reached exit velocity and is moving into the second and third generation like we have in Silicon Valley.
What role do you think universities should and can play in this?
Really a huge role. I'm going to give examples not from here necessarily. Obviously, we have the Cambridge examples, the Oxford examples, and the like. But if I go to Sheffield and look at advanced manufacturing, I look at Harlan, what we're doing in pharmacy, there clearly are these centers of expertise that do exist in many of these places, and Nottingham as well, by the way, which is great. We have a factory in Nottingham, and I know that we work closely with the university there. But we need to find a way to make these universities, may not necessarily all be pure research, but applied research and connection with industry is a very big deal. The extension centers need more commercial acumen, capability. I think, in this golden triangle, you know exactly what that means. And I think the conversations you have at Cambridge with George or with you or with others, just the relevant, the docking points for business are much clearer here than they are in some of the other places. And we need to find a way to ensure the universities level up too. They play a big role. We've seen this around the world. I mean, if I go to Tokyo, the role of Tokyo, Kyoto, Waseda, or you go down to Silicon Valley or Pittsburgh and Cleveland, Case Western with the Cleveland Clinic and University Hospitals, hugely influential in doing what Cleveland's doing or what Pittsburgh's doing as well. So I think there are real examples in the world as to how universities play a role. You have the benefit of people who are thinking, but also the benefit of people who are doing this for a grand, bigger purpose, who can, in fact, both build the skills, think really long term. Sometimes companies may or may not necessarily be able to think 50 years out. Universities can. And I think you have the ability to encourage that.
And do you think that business can help universities achieve that greater degree of relevance?
I think so. And I think that we're seeing this in Hull with the connections we have with the university. We've got a joint program. There's a master's program that's done jointly with us. Now the question is, can we scale that up even further? Can we find ways to, bring even more people through it, which will help us bring entrepreneurs and the like? Possibly, yes.
And in terms of the engagement with reskilling the local population, you said that business should assist with that. Do you think that it should be involved in the further education, colleges in the area, and should it be helping to design the programs that a business really needs? How close do you think that business should be involved?
I was involved in some of the skill building work in India years ago, when the National Skills Council was created and so on. And what's clear is skills, just for the sake of skills, don't mean really very much. What we found there was really skills that are connected with jobs actually have take. And the fact that if somebody's leaving the workforce or is doing supplemental work, you're earning a certain amount, and then you end up with a qualification of some sort, a credential of some sort, you expect that to translate into a market opportunity of some sort where the ability for you to generate wealth for yourself or money or earnings has to go up. That won't happen unless there's linkage in with business. So if I go back to the Indian experience, one of the questions really was around how do you ensure that companies are participating or working with the skills councils in order to build the kind of capability set, the rubric even, or what skills really would matter in order for people to actually get jobs. If you look at the construction industry in India, it's not obviously widespread, but in some pockets, what you have is training and skill building given on the site that actually results in people getting a certain set of skills, credentials possibly, that results in better jobs. Now that's obviously, I've left India many years ago, so I don't fully know how it's being scaled up, but that is absolutely the part of the story is you do need the link with business to ensure that what you're skill building for results in employment. Otherwise, those programs don't work.
Yeah, because the successful programs have often been the ones that have exported people to other parts of the country or to other parts of the world. So presumably business is key to keeping people in locality.
Particularly in the area. So if you look at the mix of things that you want to have, you want to be sure that you have a skilled workforce. And as you think about expansion, either for the domestic market or for the export markets, you have the ability to staff them with people locally.
Yeah. Now, all of what you're describing sounds extremely impressive and important, but it costs money. You're making investments in a place that at the moment isn't probably the most productive part of the world. Why do it from a commercial perspective? Or is it commercial?
So first of all, I'd be humble and say it's not really that impressive because it depends a bit on the results that get accomplished. And that is, I remember back to the 1994, when the first work on Cleveland Tomorrow, 95, and you see where it is today. It just takes time. You have lots of fits and starts. I remember the day when Free Markets, which is a company in Pittsburgh, did its whole procurement thing and went online and took the business. You could see how companies in Pittsburgh evolved. And today you're in a different place. This takes decades. It isn't something that happens overnight. Now, the question about there's a commercial value to this. Naturally, not the entire program can be commercially justified by one company, which is why you do need government coming in. You do need incentives. The Chancellor's incentives around skill building, around vocational training are exactly intended to do that. How do you remove the burden on business, but at the same time skill build? So government has to play a role. There's no question about it. But for us, from a very sort of commercial perspective, the inability for us to attract the right people and to create the ecosystem around where we are will be a problem over time. And, as a commercial business, you will always look at, do I put the money here? Do I put the money in Poland? Do I put the money elsewhere? This has to be competitive. And, given it's our home, we'll obviously lean in and ensure that we'll make it as competitive as possible. But there's no guarantee. I mean, if there's, governments that don't necessarily kick in and you don't have incentives, you don't have collaboration, all of it, places do get left behind. You've seen this happen in the Midwest in the US in spades.
But aren't you under some pressure to say, okay, it may yield a return in the longer term, but we could earn a much higher return in the short term simply by shifting our location to somewhere more productive?
For sure. I mean, there's no question that you always have that equation. And we're not a charity, right? We have a home, we're not a charity. And what we are doing is doing everything we can in the area, particularly the R&D side, the attraction of people, ensuring our labs are well, scaled, we're well staffed, that we have the right equipment and all of it. But we are putting the heat on saying, what's new? What are we coming up with? How do we ensure that we get more for what we're delivering? So there's no question for us, the commercial incentive for our involvement in our facilities is quite high. And, we continue to manage it like a professional business, but it doesn't take away from the fact that there is a broader good that we can also accomplish that ensures that what we are doing for now sustains over time. For me, this is a sustenance question. It isn't a near-term question.
So it's a long-term bet or long-term investment on your part, and your investors are supportive? Or how important is the foundation that you said was a part owner? Is it a significant share?
It's not a significant shareholder. It's they only own 40 million pounds or so in the business. So they're not a significant investor in that sense. And I don't think a single individual investor will necessarily think of the place we are from, and expect that we will do what we're trying to do. I don't think they work at that sort of detail level. Having said that, the conversation with our investors is a lot more sophisticated than you would imagine, because they do care about why companies exist, particularly the ones that have invested in us. And there's many pools of capital that I'd love to attract into the company. And these are pools of long-term capital that I'd love for us to have as shareholders of the company who do care about things like this, who care about What do we do with the environment? What do we do with social impact? What are we doing with regard to engagement in communities? And the nature of the conversation we have with them is very sophisticated. So there's no question it matters to many of them. Some of them have really long-term perspectives. I don't mean necessarily some of the short-term money that, of course, every company has and you want to live with. But the fact is there are long-term investors who really do care about what sort of company is this? And do we feel proud to be an investor or not?
Now, you've clearly got a strong sense of purpose in the way in which you're trying to run the company. And the business sounds as if it's got a strong sense of purpose as well. Does that go back to Isaac Reckitt, who founded the company, who I believe was a Quaker and had very strong values and principles? Is that something that you're picking up in terms of the way in which you're thinking about the purpose of Reckitt going forward?
He's a greater man than me. He created a company. He did it for multiple years. He has a statue. I don't want to even pretend in any way that, that I'm in the same league as he is. So I don't really think it's an appropriate comparison in that sense. Having said that, these are in fact the tenets of business that I think make a lot of sense. They make a lot of sense for shareholders. I think that I will never be in a position where I sacrifice what is it that long-term shareholders need from the company just because it sounds good. I'm not that kind of person. It's not going to happen. So I do care about what long-term shareholders care about. Right. And the fact is, we're making investments in the company, in the business, in order to deliver what we believe in the medium to long term we as a company are going to do. But we know that in order to do that, if I look at consumers and look at what they want, 83% of them say, I think it's 75%, some number like that, say, we want to buy products from a company with purpose. 83%, I don't buy this by the way, 83% said in some survey they pay more for it. I haven't seen that yet, but I have seen that in the survey. But it doesn't mean that we are not going to focus on ensuring our brands are anchored in purpose. And every single one of our major brands are. The link to the SDGs. I just came out of a whole day of this training for our marketers, and I was listening in as I was coming up here as well. And what is fascinating is really how excited our people get about the fact that the Vanish brand is focused on rewear, ensuring you get a longer life for your clothes, or the Finish brand is focused on ensuring that you consume less water. What it does is it results in share gain for us. Mm-hmm. And that market share gain is very important because the market share gain then helps us, frankly, deliver what our long-term shareholders want. But at the same time, what it's doing is ensuring it's doing the right thing by the community and by the business. We're not perfect by any stretch of imagination. We have issues we're still dealing with. And we have to get better, but at least what it does is it tells our people, this matters. Let's ensure we get the community around us to get where we need to get to. But let's never forget that even if we are focused on ensuring we deliver shareholder returns, we do it the right way. And part of doing it the right way, these are by the way words in our values, do it the right way. Another one we say is build shared success. And communities are in the build shared success.
Okay. Now, before I throw it open to the audience to raise questions, what's not going right? Who's not pulling their weight? Who needs to do more? And what do they need to do to really make this happen?
I think firstly, what could go faster? I think it's taken a while for place to be recognized. But now that it has, it's a chance for us to go even faster. Both from the government support, what the locals do, what we as companies do. So I think there's a speed element to this. The second element of what's not going right, if I go to the purpose question more broadly, is we still have some solves we need to make. Be it technological, be it business model, be it consumer preference, consumer behavior change, that we're still trying to learn how to do. Mm-hmm. Consumer behavior change is not the easiest thing to do. Mm-hmm. You look at hand washing. Mm-hmm. It's not the easiest thing. And we know washing hands is right. And if you believe that is the case, why do only 20% of the world wash their hands after going to the bathroom in the world? Why is that the case? We know it works. right? I think in the UK, I've used the statistic before, the numbers are scarier, 33% of men wash their hands, 66% of women wash their hands after going to the bathroom, but 99% claim they do. And so we know this is an issue. We've got to keep working on tools. We've got to work on nudge. We've got to find ways to reinforce the message that this is the right thing to do. So I think there's speed around how we bring all the resources together. There's further knowledge, insight, things that we've got to get our head around, be it new technologies, be it around behavior change, visibility across the entire supply chain, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and I might even argue scope 4. We've got to find ways to do that. That's not the easiest thing to do. And then the third element is we've got to ensure that I continue to bring not just my company, my shareholders, new shareholders I'd like to attract. That's hard.
Right.
Because it is an engagement question. So it's not that it's not happening. It's happening, but it just takes time.
But what lessons from your experience around the world could Britain be learning better in terms of how it's doing this exercise?
I think that there's recognition at the top, no question. Absolutely no question. You look at the new bill in the US, this bipartisan bill that's being debated in the US around innovation centers. And really, how do we create 35 more innovation centers in the US and attract more innovation capital, but also capital to essentially, bring those centers together in a way to drive further innovation. So it goes beyond the Boston, Silicon Valley, Seattle nexus. And, there's money available. So money being directed in there. I think, I like the idea of there's a market mechanism around how these plans get created, how people essentially bid for these plans. Mm-hmm. And then there's money that goes in beyond it. It seems like a pretty good idea that one would think about. And I think that it is, in fact, a race for capital. Mm-hmm. And we've got to somehow bring that competition element in, mm-hmm. even within areas, in order to attract, but take a look at, the UK has great examples. I mean, look at Manchester. I think what Mayor Burnham and team have done there is fascinating. I look at what's happening in Teesside, a terrific mayor there, and I think what they're doing is actually quite awesome. But two great examples. How do we get 10 more? And how do we ensure we get in the West Yorkshire too, as you see movement there too. So I think we need to find ways to get even more examples of how this has been unleashed as the nature and shape of industry just changes enormously. We also need to find a way to make it attractive for companies to list in the UK. That we actually are not just building companies to a certain scale and then they get acquired, but we've got to find ways to ensure that the FTSE has high quality companies that have come out of the UK, that tap into public markets, and that the UK does not lose its place as a great source of finance. It's a huge strength for the UK.
Great. Okay, so at this point, let's throw it open to you to raise any questions that you've got. And let me just remind people online, please to post your questions on the Q&A and we'll relay them from that. Okay, there's one over here. That's you.
Thanks very much for the talk. It's very meaningful and inspiring. So there's a kind of a rising anti-establishment sentiments in those left behind places, either in the US or in the UK. So I wonder, for companies, the government, and also to some degree the business school, so how could we cope with those kind of establishment or anti-elite sentiments and build trust and confidence with local people to achieve the goals that we're talking here today? Thank you.
I think we're a very middle-class company. My company is not an elite company, it's a very middle-class company. And it's really through local engagement of the business, the local engagement with the universities, other companies in the area. It's really bottom up, if you know what I mean. Coming in and saying top down, this is what you should do. I think the level of ownership that you have is quite low. So it's got to be a top down, bottom up. Because top down, there is some advantage because you get a sense of, wind energy. We see this big thing happening. we're going to need some, you guys, we're going to direct money that way. But at the end of it, you have to engage in the communities. And if you're not, then you will have this issue where it'll appear to be extremely elite and you will have challenges. I mean, I remember a conversation in Detroit where there was a big conversation that some major company would go in and provide free wireless access in the inner city of Detroit. But the question on the table there was not so much wireless access, which of course is an issue for broadband and all of it, but also how you deal with literacy and how do you ensure that people are going to be able to read and get away from the imprisonment of urbanization that inner city Detroit faces, where people are in some ways constrained because of a lack of public transportation. If you don't drive, you have an issue, and you're basically constrained to the area. So how do you break out of that? So people get obviously quite upset. Well, we have to recognize the problems and engage locally rather than saying, I'm going to give you free broadband, but I don't address the issue of whether you can read or not. So I think we have to be very careful about how you engage locally.
And what are your thoughts on how to do that? I mean, how do you get legitimacy for what are in essence political decisions?
I think local leadership is a very big deal. And I think mayors are playing a massive role in this. And I think if you look at future leadership in the world, obviously you have a mayor running this country, but if you look at Korea, Mayor Seoul line in to be the president, I think you see the quality of leaders in the US at the mayoral level. It's pretty staggering. And I think you saw Mayor Bloomberg and the C40 and what they've done with cities. I mean, I just met the mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone last week. Such an impressive lady. And the kind of thing she's doing there is remarkable. So mayors are a very big element, which gets back to local capacity. I, as a company, can't do very much unless there's local people to catch it. And I think we found a great group of people locally who care deeply about this issue. If they didn't, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, we've got a question on that.
So Ian Taylor from the Blavatnik School Online has said, what do you think about India's compulsory CSR mandate? Has it been successful and should other countries mirror it?
Let me explain what that is. What that is the Indian government mandates that there's a certain percent of profit that you will essentially direct towards social causes. That's really what the CSR mandate is. And for us, we obviously have a CSR mandate as well because we're a big business in India, and we direct it to things that actually drive a variety of good causes, including Dettol in 650,000 schools in India to help with hand washing, teaching intimate wellness and broader wellness to the entire Northeast in the Birds and Bees program, which we fund, as well as community involvement, which is quite large. It's a very interesting idea. The only thing I would say is that, I've personally said that we will donate the equivalent of 1% of our operating profit every year worldwide. So we're doing that. We did that last year. We actually donated 1.5% because of the pandemic. And obviously people say, oh, you had a little bit of a, not a little bit, you had tailwind and all of it. We gave away 1.5%, the equivalent of that. And we're doing 1% every single year as part of social impact. I think it's a very good idea. I think mandating it at that level across the entire world is a bit more complicated to pull off because every company, every country has sort of different intentions. I don't know whether you'll be able to pull it off, but it's a very good idea for us in India. And we clearly are making a difference with it.
First of all, thank you very much for the talk. One question going back to the role of, or the possible role of the central government. We've been waiting here in the UK for a while now for the white paper on leveling up. So my question for you is, what would you like to see in this white paper? For you as a business, what are the sort of activities, strategies you want to see? Thank you.
First of all, I know that the government's working very hard on this. I know that, and I know that as well, that I know it was supposed to be out soon, but it's going to be out hopefully end of the year, the early part of next year. I think there is some level of policy that is required around what is it we need to essentially win at, and how we're going to direct funding to make that happen. It's happening in various parts of Europe even, right? As you look at Germany or other places where you clearly have some of that going on. And so what I'm hoping is this clarity around what we're going to be famous for, so to speak, what we're going to win at, and the how that's going to happen with a combination of innovation incentives, with skill building incentives, and I'm going to call it approaches. Perhaps you're looking at the Catalyst program that exists and saying, we've had some successes and maybe not some successes in the Catalyst program. How do we find a way to scale that up even further and make it so that business can dock into extension centers, universities, and the like in a way that's going to work? The government's really done quite a lot of good work in this whole area. I know they've been working. I know part of today's engagement was going to be about that, around innovation and what's to come and so on. So, but I really hope that it will come and that we'll essentially put weight behind it around choices and how we enable it, and the role of various people who can then look at that and say, we're going to have X number of clusters. We're going to do this in those clusters. It's going to be very important. Here's what we're going to encourage. It gives you a bit of a framework of stability for companies as well as for people in the area to then begin to start doing the work.
There's obviously been quite a lot of debate, some cynicism about how real the government's commitment to this is. Do you think that it's now really getting its act together and that it's going to change?
The job of the government is hard. I have not been in one interaction with people in the government that does not suggest to me that this is core to them. Not one. It's just hard. And as you deal with them, you understand how complicated all of this is. So many different priorities, things they have to do in this context of what's changing in the country. But I have not been in one conversation that suggests it's not core.
And do you see business rallying behind this across the country, not just in Hull? Is this something that...
Look, the story of Oxford, Cambridge, and the Golden Triangle is very clear. There's business rallying around that, absolutely. You see new companies being created, absolutely. The biotechnology, the life sciences paper, all that. Clearly, you see that. The question is, what about the rest?
Yep.
And I think Manchester's done an amazing job, no question. Teesside is doing a very nice job. You see BP, for example, doing all kinds of things around the country for their cities. It's obviously very important to them. You see BT doing that with broadband and the roll-up of broadband and the whole EV structure that is being essentially thought about, and the combination of BP and BT and the rest. So it is, you do see examples of companies leaning in, but some more clarity would really help. And I think that it will get even more companies to step in beyond the Golden Triangle, where there's a lot of activity, which I don't want to even talk about.
Is there enough of a spark, of a sense that there's a real potential for generating returns from investing in the way in which you're investing?
I mean, if you look at Teesside, the conversation with them is so positive that you say, and particularly as the nature of industry is changing, you look at wind power, batteries, all the stuff that's coming that I think we're going to need. There's no question in my mind that they feel very good about what they're doing, and companies linked up with them feel very good about it. Now the question is, what about the rest? What are we doing in Wales? Is it just going to still be a Swansea Cardiff challenge? Are we going to get both? What are we going to do with the rest of the world, the rest of the UK? Those, I think, are real questions that I think, I think will become clearer over time.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thank you for the interesting talk. You mentioned that, I guess, you mentioned that oftentimes investors, more short-term time horizons, presented some interesting challenges when it came to, I guess, investing more in a localized area and leveling that up. Do you think there's anything missing in terms of getting investors and stakeholders to see these long-term plans? And if so, how is your business and how are businesses in your sector, you think, handling that challenge?
Well, the first thing, to be clear, I think I had said this, the majority of our investors are long-term investors. They care about what we're doing for the medium term or the long term. It doesn't mean you don't have some short-term investors, because the average holding in the stock, and it's not that you don't. Every company does, and that's just life. It doesn't work. But you solve for the long-term investors, and you do this in a way that helps them gain confidence that what you're doing is going to create real shareholder value medium to long term. And some of the short-term investors actually do benefit as well, because you're making the right investments, performance. As long as you're a steady performer, they do well as well. So I solve for the long-term shareholders, and I ensure that the investments we are making are in line with their, with what they would expect us to do.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question is more from the lens of left behind places. And I was hoping to seek your opinion on how do you think redistribution of economic power in an organization like yours could look like, so that it is held by everyone, just like how political power is held by everyone in a healthy and ideal democracy.
So maybe you can expand on the question.
Yeah, so for example, one of the ways how redistribution of economic power can look like is how there is more, I would say, power within maybe the workers of a workplace, for example, right? So I'm just thinking not just from the economics point of view, but from the economic power per se point of view as well. And if you have any thoughts on that.
I think employee engagement is clearly very important, right? I think you're going further than that. You're looking for structural things that one does to redefine the corporation and how it's governed. I think that's really what you're really trying to essentially get at. And I do think that in certain countries in Europe, you do have more of that, and we do have engagements with the Works Council in various places. We're obviously trying to do the right thing by our workforce as well. We've made commitments on living wages and what we do around the world. It's not just in the UK. There are things around modern slavery, the commitments we've made that ensure that there's a foundation for that. We report that as part of our social commitments and what we do. So there's transparency into what we have. And I think that, we report even more number of countries than what is in some ways required around this notion of living wages and, the fair living wages around the world. So I think as a company, we're trying to set the right tone as to what that means.
Just pursuing that, is the idea of engaging employees on the board something that you've thought about? Is that
No, by the way, we do have board engagement. So we have one of the board members whose role is employee engagement. We just came out of our September meetings where the board engaged with various sets of employees from around the company to get their perspectives of how things are going. And then they sent me a feedback note, on that early this week. The board is engaged with NGOs to understand their perspectives. So we set up listening sessions for them with some of the key, stakeholders. They go to factories where they do meet, obviously, workers and, get input on those visits. So there is a bit of a holistic engagement with the employee base. And the board is getting perspectives which are quite broad beyond what I would show them, from various people in the company.
And would that include the local community in Hull? Do you engage?
So that's a good question. We haven't necessarily, the board went to Hull 2 years ago. I was going to take them last year in September. But the pandemic came and we went entirely virtual, so that has not happened yet. But next September, I think they will go back there again. So you've got to work this in the context of boards and timeframes and meetings, agendas, and all of that.
So your board meetings will be in Hull?
No. They're in London.
Right.
And they are in London. That's
Right.
where they are, because we bring a board from all over the world. But, next September, my hope is that I'll take the board to Hull so they can actually see what's going on.
I see. Right. Okay.
Hi. So you mentioned earlier how your firm needs help from government, like authorities or other businesses, like your partners as all. But how do you handle a situation where these different bodies conflict with your interests or do not align with your firm's interests?
We're always trying to find places where there's some commonality. So you may disagree on many things, but there's a few things you agree on. You start working from that. And it's really important to understand that, which requires listening and engagement. If I said, 80 things that we don't agree on, and then I said, forget it, even if we agree on 20, we won't make progress in the world. It's true both outside the company as also inside. Yeah.
Question there?
Yeah, I was curious what the scope is within leveling up of promoting investment into R&D, and in particular how you think, within that, whether there's scope for the government to steer that. One could obviously think about, agglomeration effects in specific areas. Should we be thinking of Hull as the center for innovation in X, Y, Z? And should we be thinking about other places as the centers of innovation in something else? Or do you think there's sort of purely a market level decision where the government has no immediate place?
I think the market, if I were to just say the market is not going to, in effect, solve this problem completely. It's a belief set I have, because I think the market has shown its ability to go after places where the returns are amazing. But when you need to distort the scale of what is going on, you're going to need some other factors coming in, no question. So the market alone can't do it. I think the government has done things around innovation. I mean, the super deduction that the Chancellor announced some time ago is an example of that. But I think what you're talking about is beyond that, to say super deduction is fantastic, but can we now direct to place that you become this, you become that? It's a combination of various factors, right, that you've got to essentially do. If you look at the US example, one of the areas around how you think about these 35 different clusters, the innovation clusters that the government might in some ways encourage, it is based a little bit on what is there right now, but also, do you have the capability set to take that and scale that 2, 3, 4 times more than what you have done so far? So you're going to start from somewhere. I can't go to a pit and say, hey, you've done nothing really, but you're going to be my center for biotechnology. It's very hard to do that. There's got to be some rationale for what that is. And that gets to university, that gets to the local company, the local leadership, institutions like hospitals or whatever it might be that are actually partaking of research, that could essentially come together and say, we have the semblance of things, or there's a new industry emerging like wind or whatever it might be in that area. We're going to find ways to take that and make that globally competitive. And I think is something clearly that could be done.
And just tell us how that process is happening in Hull. It sounds as if it's focusing on wind as a...
It's really just more broadly alternate energy.
Alternative.
If I can use that broader term.
So how's this common purpose, if you like, evolving in Hull?
So we would love, obviously. So I think to me, what is happening is that you've got local companies, a set of them, engineering. You've got obviously transportation coming in there with our Arup and so on. You've got Siemens and what they're doing with wind power. So clearly examples of people who are doing the new thing. You've also got the port. And the port is in effect, looking to find ways to become globally competitive too. And you've got people like us in life sciences and consumer health who are looking for linkages back in there into the university in order to continue to scale up what we do. So every single one of these major companies in there has a bit of an angle in terms of what to do. What we're doing is working with the government to say, listen, we need to find ways to enable what happens in Hull. That's the conversation. So assuming the government picks it as one of the clusters, which we hope they will do, we hope what they will do is define 3 or 4 areas where we think the Humber side could be big in, and then hopefully what we can then do is attract venture capital, attract other, I'm going to call it market-making mechanisms into the area in order to develop it, while we as a group find ways to unleash what's happening locally.
Okay, so the government identifies, shall we say, 2 or 3 sectors or activities in Hull that are going to be the focus of cluster formation. What do they do then? Is that it? Do they then withdraw?
No, but then what they have to do then is, of course, you've got the ability to direct. There are lots of people coming in and saying, we would like to do something in the UK. Well, there's got to be a way to take that investment and direct it to the area. But in addition, what we have to do is with the VC firms, with the guys who are alumni of the area that we're trying to attract back in. We've got to start funneling that investment in new companies and new ideas, while at the same time building schools, leveling up the university, getting the port to where it needs to be, making the city a highly livable place. It's a culture city, but how do we then make it a culture city? How do we find ways to make it the way? How do we take the airport and build greater connectivity into Europe and other places as need be? That's the work that needs to happen, that is then creating the environment for things to happen.
And government investment in infrastructure to...
Government direction of money into infrastructure development would be a great thing.
Direction rather than...
I think that at some point in time, the government's going to say, here's how much we can really do. It's going to have to be matched with private capital and or with patient capital, as you might call it.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, it's really a follow-on from that question and an earlier question about national government policy. I think you said earlier, you're anxious to see the white paper appear and you wanted a sense of direction and some choice, I think, in terms of what we were good at. Of course, as Colin mentioned in his introduction, there's a history of industrial and regional policy in the UK of what was called in the past picking winners, which according to many researchers, actually turned out to be picking losers. Pick the wrong sectors and so on and so forth. Are we in a better position today to avoid picking losers rather than winners?
It's a great question. And I think, it gets back a little bit to what you mean by that. Because I think if you were to do it, take a look at the Cleveland example. If someone would say the example there was going to be that we're going to be the world center, Cleveland's going to be the world center for, just name it, automotive technology. It could have been possible. I mean, you're the big, largest automotive company based there, an engineering university, proximity to Detroit, whatever. But instead, what happened organically, healthcare developed because there were 3 or 4 institutions that actually had the ability to scale up. I think if you pick without basis, it's a problem. And I think it's going to have to therefore be enabling the picking, which sometimes will then be organic, if you see what I mean. I mean, we know we have a wind sector that's going to emerge there. We know that we have the characteristics in there for us to have large wind farms. We know that. I mean, we see that. People are putting places in there, and we know we need renewable energy. Picking Hull for wind, as an example, or renewable energy more broadly, or adaptation. We have floods. It's adaptation technology that the University of Hull is really very good at. And, was part of the link with Freetown, how you saw adaptation with floods. Obviously Amsterdam has it, Hull has it too. Right? So how do we find ways to pick a few things that actually the area is great at, but then create the enablers for investment to attract the capital in infrastructure and otherwise, in order for organic emergence as well. So I think going back to the old meaty days in Japan and so on, saying we're going to do this, I don't know whether we can fully do that yet here, but there has to be some direction, which I think you can begin to see the pockets of that emerging. But doing it without the absence of, say in Cambridge Biotech or Oxford, that there are elements in here already that can actually be scaled. And of course, the Golden Triangle doesn't quite need that, but the rest of the country does.
We've got one question online.
This is from Kudzai from Balliol College. In driving these initiatives, do you actively engage your competitors, participate and contribute resources, vote with their balance sheets?
There are 30 companies in the area are companies from the area. So does that mean that, I'm talking about a place-based view. I'll come back to the other question that you have more broadly. That's companies in the area who are essentially collaborating. If I look at some of the broader questions on sustainability or purpose that you may or may not have asked in your question, there's no question that we have to engage with some of our competitors on a pre-competitive basis. And that's where forums like the Consumer Goods Forum really play a role. If I look at plastics or recycling infrastructure in various parts of the world, you can't just do it yourself because it's a system that needs to fall into place. And that's going to require partnership. And it's going to require not just competing, but also collaboration in a way that actually gets that infrastructure in place. So there are a lot of efforts around pre-competitive collaborations that do exist, including in things like plastic.
Okay, I think there was a question at the back. So okay, all right, we'll go here first, and then we'll come back to you, all right?
Thank you. I'd be very interested in your thoughts, as you've expressed a couple of times. Sitting here in Oxford, it wouldn't be seen as a prime case for levelling up. And yet within Oxford and Oxfordshire communities, there are localities, communities where there is a very strong case for levelling up. So the issues around levelling up can exist clearly at an economic regional level, a locality. They can exist within it. I'd be very interested in your thoughts as to how one achieves intergenerational levelling up, albeit within affluent regions, not just within those where the region itself clearly is in need of economic regeneration itself.
I think at a meta level, you might argue, if you look at India versus you look at the US, you're arguing really the point around, exactly that. It's just at a bigger scale than what you currently have. I think it gets back to on the intergenerational side, how you think about skill building, how you think about education, how you think about job creation more proactively, because you do need jobs to be created, and you need them to be more productive, and you need them to be open so you get vertical mobility. And in Richard Reeves and all his work at Brookings around, some of the issues on the vertical mobility in societies are very complicated to address. And I think even in a place like Oxfordshire, if you have that challenge, just imagine the challenge in some of the other parts of the world. So I think to me, your question is correct. At this point in time, I know I was ignoring the Golden Triangle, but the reality is because some of the problems of inclusion and the diversity in other places is even much larger than here. So I was only talking about that in that context. Wasn't intending to leave out some of the communities here that I know will probably need some intervention.
A question here.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the talk. I want to come back to the question of innovation. And as you rightly say, in places like Hull, it is very likely that government will have to take the lead on any form of investment in the earlier stage companies, the SMEs of this world. Now, speaking as a manager of a government-funded venture fund, I know that one of the issues that very often we have difficulty with is articulating the kind of returns in the wider economic impact that they should expect and even think about. And my observation within these four walls, I take it it's the Chatham House rules, is
it's just online, just remember.
Anyway, but I think that it isn't widely appreciated or looked for, the kind of returns that investment in the younger generation companies can deliver. And I'm just wondering whether your view is that government is sufficiently looking at the benefits rather than the costs of an investment package that you might be talking about.
Well, I think there's two parts to this. I remember this whole conversation in a piece of work I did years ago on this. In Hull, for example, or in the area, it's about really directing other funds that are coming in, perhaps through government-sponsored entities, or frankly encouraging private capital to show up there, because there's a whole bunch of opportunity, like it's happening in Cleveland and Pittsburgh and other places. But one of the big questions is there is market failure. And some of the government funding around viability gap, if I could use that word, where I'll take the example of skill building. Some of the skill building ventures do not generate the 20% return that a lot of private capital is going to look for. And it could be in pipe fitting or welding or whatever it might be. It might get there, but it may not. Now, in those cases, you still need those people. You still know those people are in there. And the question is there a role for a sovereign type entity that actually does viability gap funding that says, I'll bridge you between 10 and 20 or 8 and 20 and whatever it is. But we know we need these skills to be built. And that kind of a direction is actually quite interesting in some ways, you might argue, in terms of the kind of returns you might get, which also attracts private capital to go into things, like you might have. So that's kind of the nature of what I was also talking about around, where the government funding can actually play a role in, particularly in areas like skills.
Let's come back to you.
Thank you for being here. Similar to something that he raised, I would like to know your thoughts on really how much profit is too much profit, And would it be reasonable for society and governments to expect businesses to take up socially meaningful causes where there is no commercial interest involved whatsoever?
So if you look at the work we do with the CSR budgets and so on, I think there's no commercial interest per se in that sense. Obviously, we're doing things in the community. We're trying to build habits. We're trying to, in effect, make a change. And so I feel pretty good about that part of it. That is, you do get a balance in here. I think your broader question is what is capitalism question, which is a very difficult one, if I might say so, to answer in 5 minutes. But I'm a capitalist. I believe in the fact that with capitalism, you do get greater growth, you get greater prosperity. But capitalism alone hasn't done it. I mean, this whole question about leaving people behind, leaving places behind, means there's something wrong with a capitalistic system in itself. And that has led to the market failures that capitalism so well depends on. So if your point is it truly the panacea and it's going to solve everything we have? The answer is clearly not. But I don't think we've found a better system yet, as they would say. And my question really becomes one of, we're going to need to find that. And I think the government-business partnership and society partnership is actually key in making that happen, to find that right spot. We're not at the right spot right now.
I think that's a very important point, and the notion of not jettisoning capitalism, but finding ways to make it function in a form that it really does address these issues, lies behind a lot of what we're talking about here. And as you're saying, cooperation as well as competition. And when we think about capitalism, we automatically think about competition. But I think what's coming out from here is the importance of cooperation within the corporate sector, across companies in a region, between government and business. Those are elements that we haven't developed sufficiently to date, but are key to solving this problem. So I think that that's absolutely right. We'll have one more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Thank you very much for a great talk. So two of the areas that strike me as being quite important that we haven't discussed so far are, number one, kind of the move towards remote working and whether that will affect people's propensity, for example, to move from central cities to more regional locations. And then on the other hand, I also think it's what has happened in the context that I've seen is that a lot of public amenities don't really catch it. So even if you do get the economic growth, local regions don't have the housing stock that's the kind of quality that's necessary. You see that in San Francisco, you see that in Dublin, where schooling systems aren't keeping up. From a business perspective, how do you think about encouraging the government or working with the government to try and address these issues where they are an issue in bringing talent to these cities still, even when you do kind of get the skill growth?
I think the two of them are linked, the two parts of your question are actually quite linked. And you see that happen in the Silicon Valley area, that as you have remote working and you run into the constraints that come from, I'm just going to call it, unchanneled or urbanization, where you haven't had the support systems necessarily keep up with it. People are finding options, and they're essentially migrating to various states in and around keeping their jobs, and people are going to 100%, all that. So you clearly see the two parts of your question actually being quite linked. Now, the question really is, what do you therefore do about it? Some of it is about governance. I mean, the Bay Area, the governance of the Bay Area is one of the most complicated elements of, really thinking about how various cities come together, even for urban transit. I mean, BART, which is the urban transit system in the Bay Area, is significantly impacted by just the breakdown of governance of the various sort of small, whether it's San Bruno and San Mateo, and whether it's Palo Alto, for going down to San Jose. How do you actually bring all these different groups together in order to make this work? How do you think about housing stock? Particularly in a place where you have zone limitations that lead you to a certain outcome that results in very long commutes and actually makes life very difficult. Of course, that gets resolved a bit when you have remote working. So the two of them are actually quite linked, your two questions. And I think that the ability for business to engage with local government in order to get the kind of policy that actually enables their workforce to live well is a really big deal. I mean, at the heart of it, this is what drives us. I mean, the reason we're doing this in some ways is also to ensure I can continue to attract people into my company, that they work in Hull, that they innovate in Hull. I have a complete self-interest in doing this, right? So that gets back to me being capitalist. Of course, there is a broader good that comes from it. But if I don't have, I have these two French people who work there. I talked to the lady and I said, help me understand. You've been here 20 years. Why are you, as a French person, living in Hull? And by the way, they say Hull, much like the people there too, as well. And the fact of the matter is that, I raise children. This area is great for raising children. I like it. And if I want to have something fun, I come to London for a day or an evening. So they found a way around this, right? But it's in my self-interest to engage with the local communities. And government needs to evolve governance, particularly at the local city level. And you're seeing that happen. You look at Greater Manchester, you look at the Teesside, how they're bringing together various people, even the Humberside, cross-party and political lines. They realize a sense of place. Where that happens, it's going to be very positive. Where it's not, you are going to see the egress that you're seeing. I mean, I know my friends in California would hate me saying this, but there is a reason why Austin and others are becoming places where people get attracted to. Low taxes, you've got homes, you can work remotely, you're going to move. So I think it's a big issue, but the two are linked.
The average tenure of a CEO is around about 5 years now.
4 years, 4.3. And who's counting? Sorry.
Is that long enough to achieve what you're aiming for?
There is a spread. There is a spread, right? So you essentially have some CEOs who are lower, others who are longer. I don't think it's about CEO tenure as much as it is about ensuring that the organization understands a sense of place. And that as legacy, when you leave the organization, they know where they're from and they know why they exist. And if you're able to do that, you've actually had a good tenure, while ensuring that as you do that, you deliver for shareholders in the medium and long term, and that you also do the right thing by the communities that you're in. That is, in fact, truly what a great CEO has to do.
Well, I think that's a tremendous purpose to have as a CEO. Laxman, thank you so much for having got this series off to such a tremendous start. It's really been absolutely fascinating.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Extremely grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here.